Glenn, great to finally start this series. 5 years now in the working together. It feels like a little bit overdue, in fact, I thought. And we have done so many panels and planning calls together. This is just a more, I think, natural extension to all of these conversations, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's nice to finally continue to create or follow up on our original ideas as we go through it. I mean, we may be from potentially different sides of the aisle in the marketing world or the capital markets world, and you look at business planning, and you've got such a great history in all that you've done. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the spirit behind intelligent capital, conversations between practitioners like ourselves, and we want to bring in other practitioners going forward. Of course, it's not about theory; it's about really evolving business models and talk about straight talk, how markets, how ideas actually evolve. And, climate felt like, I think, the right first topic for us today, not because the series is about climate, but because I think it sits at this crossroad, which is really interesting between capital, policy, innovation. And, I watched Climate Week from Zurich. I couldn't come over to New York this year. And I regretted it because I later, watched some of our recordings, and it's so interesting. You see really what's going on behind the scenes, and plenty of speeches, but also quiet, serious work is really happening behind those scenes. And you know what really struck me during Climate Week is a mix of companies that showed up. And we obviously had really Fortune 500 companies, but also smaller evolving ones. And I think one cluster for me that was really around buildings.
Yeah.
Right? You watched Aquila, the session with Aquila. I mean, it was so interesting. And then we had Johnson Controls and even the Well Buildings Institute. I mean, they talked about stuff I haven't even heard about before that is already in operation in a lot of buildings. So smart systems that actually can cut energy while using and improving spaces we live and work in.
No,
And then for me, there was this other big theme around a different theme. In fact, it was more about capital infrastructure, and we had people like Dan Labovitz talking about the green impact exchange that he built, working on the mechanics that allow climate projects and access proper market liquidity. And I don't know about you, Glenn, but I think this liquidity theme comes up a lot if we talk to entrepreneurs and the C-suite these days about climate.
It was a busy week, like you said. We had some giants, people representing the giant companies. We had some startups. You had people with a great regulatory legacy, like a Dan Labowitz. Dan and I were colleagues at the New York Stock Exchange, and now really as a startup entity with SEC approval now to actually get up and start launching this green impact exchange. And even the creation of Dan talked about in his panel, creation of an actual product, an exchange
Wow.
traded product called the Safe Trust, and working on getting approval for that. So people are really putting their money where their mouth is. It's always interesting when you, as a New Yorker, it's those week or two in September that you can't get crosstown because
Right.
it's that crazy. And people, and that was certainly our experience. They're so busy and they're so booked. They would come in, they come in for a period of time, and then they're off to their next talk because everybody was in demand, for sure. And some of the companies that you mentioned there, they were certainly present for us at our One Business World program and the like. And whenever you think about these types of things, I mean, Henning, it does kind of feel like two worlds, right? There's the everything that gets surrounded with it, right? All of the optics, and the other is, okay, tell me about some outcomes. What might come next? Where are people looking, putting their bets?
Right. Yeah, I thought around that. That was basically the third cluster, if you will, right? These industrial innovators that are, doing this for a long time, like Cisco and GM, but also newer ones like IFS, who are doing a lot of stuff in AI-related technologies around many industries. And I listened to LanzaTech, who's super interesting, and their work, TAE Technologies, Josemit Clean Energy. And I think each of them is tackling different problems and really hard problems. But what they all have in common, I think, is there's a commercial logic behind it. It's not about, let's change the world and bring down climate, or tackle climate change. That's not really the objective. The objective is commercial, but at the same time, it has that impact that was at the center of Climate Week, so to speak, but not from a policy perspective, really from a commercial business outcome perspective, if you will, right?
I think, when you get the commercial outcomes, and this kind of comes across, I think, certainly in the US and with the current administration, if you could present that commercialization of
Right.
here's how you get your return on investment. Forget about what you may call it or where it came from, but if you can present that kind of business case, you have a pretty good chance of moving forward, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we had Chris Wright at one of our sessions earlier this year. Very smart people are part of this administration. And then, of course, you had President Trump addressing the UN, and I listened to his speech. It resonated with me because I know many in the climate space would disagree with his politics, but what he said something that really stuck with me, and it was, strong words don't solve problems, right? I actually agree with him and his really realism on that. And I think it's all about sovereignty. It's about delivery. It's about outcomes, not about declarations. And the UN, you can say what you want, but they have all been about declarations. It was never really about action. And the UN, I think, and as Trump said in his speech, has tremendous potential, but it's often long on words and unfortunately short on action. And I think I totally agree with your observation. The administration that we have in the US right now, they're listening when it comes to capital rewards and execution. And you could see that now with the developments in Israel as well. I mean, this is
Oh, no,
historic what is happening
right,
right
yeah.
now in
No,
Israel,
yeah,
right?
no
Bringing
shortage of news
together.
this morning, right? You're moving away from actual, as you said, declarations and here's a tangible outcome. Here's 20
Right,
people now home with their families,
right.
and that becomes an important, if you're looking at data and measurement points, that becomes an important point for sure.
Right, right, right. I mean,
Well,
yeah,
Henning, you mentioned declarations. It's also interesting, you talk about around the world, and there's lots of charts out there when you look at, who's contributing to what, and often some countries in the world often score very, very low on those types of climate related type of items, scorecards, if you will. And it's interesting. What I found interesting during the week is as certain countries were making, let's call it trial balloon kind of declarations, a lot of people grabbed onto that. And I guess you can't fault them because maybe some of these countries like a China haven't really said that before, right?
right.
Potential goals. And all of a sudden here they're announcing something. And it was interesting to see how people kind of grabbed onto that really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, China is a good example where they actually are more on execution, less on goals, right? And then suddenly you realize they're so far ahead with some of that stuff. And it's this kind of quiet execution that is really interesting,
Right.
right?
And sometimes it's under the covers, and you're right. Maybe they aren't telling about it perhaps as they should. But at the end of the day, data, and we, coming from the world of capital markets,
Right.
capital raises and the like, my old boss Kathy Kinney at the stock exchange used to say, the market will tell you, Glenn. The market knows, right? So
Right.
when you take out some of that noise, right, where do you see the capital flowing?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Germany and we were told, nuclear is the devil basically, right? And now, markets see that very differently. Nuclear, uranium linked stocks are up 35% year to date. And it comes from a reset because we had people like Bill Gates who suddenly embraces as part of the climate agenda to boost nuclear. And then these big environmental transition ETF, they're barely positive, right, this year compared even to the S&P, which is around 20% up. So markets have made their choice, and they're rewarding technologies that really deliver stable energy, but also I think visible cash flow in the end, not stories that depend on that perfect policy.
Everything old is new again, right? I mean, I grew up on Long Island, and we had the Shoreham nuclear plant that became front page news,
Right,
and actually never got online
right,
after all of that. And then here in New York State, we had Governor Cuomo. He closed Indian Point, and the ramifications of what that decision kind of came from, and trying to come back. But here we are now circling back and saying, if we're looking for that, that kind of cleaner footprint, maybe nuclear power. And we certainly at One Business World had a whole bunch of talks on fusion and
yeah.
the power of fusion. But you think about that as coming back from a sustainability standpoint, and again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, probably would have thought that was impossible.
Right, right. I mean, my father, he when he was a small boy, I mean, no boy, but a teenager, he started in coal mining, and then he worked himself up in the biggest, energy company in Germany, E.ON, and he told me, like, 40 years ago, said, nuclear will stay, and nuclear is important because we have to get away from that dirty coal. So the only way to do that in a scalable, fast way is nuclear, and he's right. I mean, France actually has shown that for decades, if you will, and we're now seeing governments, we're seeing private investors rediscovering it, and this time I think with better financing models and modular designs, we get a better outcome. And as you said, there's a notion of regulatory approval, and I think under the current administration you will see that going much faster. And
Yeah.
so I think from an investment perspective, nuclear has become so much more interesting. Uranium, by the way, as well. And personally, I like always companies that provide you that critical infrastructure, or at least access to that engineering components, servicing. And it's outside of that Max 7 world that everyone is talking about, but they're also betting on technology, and they're providing picks and shovels, if you will, to a lot of what we are seeing right now in AI.
You mentioned uranium. I was watching last night on Turner Classic Movies the great Cary Grant film Notorious with Claude Rains and Ingrid Bergman.
Right,
And the
right.
secret was there was uranium deposit down in the wine cellar, and they were thinking of espionage and all that goes
Ah,
on
wow.
with that. And it was like the climactic scene was, where is it coming from? Well, there's these mountains here that we in I guess it was Argentina, where we were visiting and trying to explore that. You mentioned France too. We had Dr. Felix. He is he is France's representative at the consulate in DC on nuclear energy, and he's a world of information, and just such a pleasant man, and great advocate of all the possibilities that you've been talking about.
Right,
For
right. And
sure.
I think people often forget it's part of a mix. It's not only nuclear, it's not only coal, it's not only oil. It's this mix, right, that is changing. And I think renewables fit in that too. Even the Trump speech at the UN was very anti-renewables in a way, complaining about wind and solar. But for me, I have to disagree with him on that. I think the cost for wind and solar fell so dramatically that actually we now see that becoming a good business case. I mean, the argument of the administration would probably be that this was bought through subsidies, and that this doesn't make sense. You would have to look at the numbers, but the costs are dramatically lower now than they were 10 years ago. And I think grids are hitting physical limits now, and that's a fact. So we need a portfolio approach. I think nuclear is one. It's for consistency. Then it's renewables. It's more diversity, and then you have the rest, right? And it's all about better storage to smooth that kind of volatility that we're seeing now through AI and through other technologies.
Well, it's an interesting that you say portfolio, right? Because
Right.
why wouldn't it be like your retirement fund, right? You're not all in, mobile pet salons.
Right.
or gold bars, or it's gonna be a mix of everything. And why can't, from a sustainability standpoint, we look to maybe, okay, even some industries, maybe the best elements of those. Why can't they be part of what goes on?
That's right. And that's a big shift. I mean, climate finance used to be moral, say anti-oil, anti-effect. No, no, no. It's about operational effectiveness and how do we keep the economy running. And a lot
Yeah,
of still depends on fossil.
yeah,
We just say fossil will stop for the next 10 years. It just won't because our technology still depend on that. But it's going to transition and that takes time. And in the meantime, you have other solutions, and I feel that in that whole climate discussion, they are rarely mentioned. Carbon capture, right?
yeah. We had a couple of talks on carbon capture. What's the state for carbon capture you've been seeing?
Well, Glenn, good. I mean, I think it's really selective in terms of what's out there, but it's investable. So the smartest industrials are already running pilot projects, and it's done quietly. That's why the media hasn't picked up on it so much. But I think capturing emissions from cement, from chemical plants, it's really cheaper than paying these penalties through emissions. And for investors, it's not about picking a one carbon capture stock. It's more this ecosystem that is currently building, and to see how our companies position themselves in that ecosystem, building the pipelines, the storage facilities, the tech that monitors and verifies the results of carbon capture. And I think that's where the durable returns will sit. But I'm a
Yeah.
big fan of carbon capture. I'm also a big fan of geoengineering. The UN has stopped that conversation for years. And the only countries that were pushing for that was Switzerland and Canada. And the argument was always from the UN side, "Oh, you're playing God here. It's so dangerous to change the weather." It's like, yeah, the weather is changing already. If you have technology that can address that, let's at least experiment with this in a controlled way. And carbon capture fits into that
Yeah.
in terms of how we can actually physically, we are now in a position as mankind, we are so advanced, we can actually tackle the weather through technology. And I think it's much more effective than telling people, the whole capitalist system is at the end, you can't produce anymore, you can't consume anymore because we're going to all die from weather events. Hey, we have the means to to address that, right? And that's why I'm a big fan of carbon capture, but also geoengineering.
Well, you look at that again, thinking of like as a portfolio, and to me, it sounds like more of the plumbing or the
Right.
infrastructure side. It's not so much those not to pick on Silicon Valley, but those
That's
Silicon
right.
Valley moonshots where they go out and it's like, hey, I only need one of these to click. You're really talking about building out sustainability through really everybody participating, having kind of like an infrastructure fund.
Exactly. It's not a moonshot, is plumbing. And plumbing always pays.
Yeah.
You get it out of the plumbing. But let me flip it, Glenn, from your side. How are boards and acquirers reacting to this shift? Because you're very familiar with what's happening on the board side.
Well, they've stopped being ostriches, which is good, right? They previously would have their head, kind of buried in the sand and really wouldn't worry about it. Every so often maybe they would drop the word sustainability or what's our future point of view on this? Because let's face it, people and boards develop strategic plans and the like, right? That's always going to be the case. I think they're doing a lot more due diligence on it. But again, as a board and having that fiduciary responsibility, okay, things changed perhaps, 6 or 7 years ago when the Business Roundtable came out and reintroduced the word stakeholder to us as opposed to shareholder. But still, at the end of the day, they are looking for, okay, what's going to be the payback, right? If I do this, if I make these investments, if we participate in this space, again, what may we see? What may not only our shareholders but our stakeholders see as they examine these potential, moves or getting involved.
Right. I mean, that sounds like real progress, and you can see the mindset across public markets and private markets, of course. Where I see it in particular is, by the way, in the insurance sector that always was far ahead of everyone else because, of course, they had to price in climate change into their premiums, and they have to assess the risk in order to get the right price in the end. And you can see that with the primary insurers, but also reinsurers that have very sophisticated systems to look at what is happening with climate and biodiversity, by the way. And I always find them very interesting, and I look at them. What are they, how are they thinking about this? Because this gives you the risk perspective, and then you see on the opportunity perspective, you see companies that really demonstrate actual energy savings, and they're being rewarded, and the boards acknowledge that, right? So efficiency,
Yeah.
building tech firms with solid multi-year revenue streams and cash flow streams. And you see mid-teen returns, you see steady compounding, no hype. And that's, I think, the story most people miss. The boring companies are often the ones who are doing much more, or beating, in fact, the flashy ones, if you will.
Well, there's always going to be the balance between effectiveness and efficiency, right?
Right,
Effectiveness tends to be very visible, right?
right.
Hey, the stock price went up, our valuation went up. Efficiency is kind of like the silent warrior, right? It kind of kind of
Well put.
kind of
Yes,
runs
yes.
kind of runs under the covers, and it's invisible. But if you really pay attention, it moves quickly.
Right, and it brings down your cost ratio, and that's still elevated in many industries. Speaking of innovation, I mean, fusion came up a lot during Climate Week, and I
Yeah.
was wondering how you feel about this. Is this still early, or do you see there's momentum?
Yeah, a lot of momentum. Again, a couple of talks on fusion. I think fusion wrapped around artificial intelligence and the whole power conversation along those lines. We had some chats on data centers and how much energy they're going to require as companies look to do more with machine learning as they try. We even heard things about God, stuff I haven't heard from like the 1960s, the old Lost in Space series, things with plasma being discussed, and
Right.
how do we take these types of scientific type of experiments, and which used to take you know forever to develop, and they're right here now in the future. They're here for this for the.
How many years do you think this is away? It's like, are we talking like 5 years, 10 years, or
You know what? Long-term plans used to be 7 to 10. Now long-term is probably no more than 3. So
right?
I would think we're going to be here, pretty quickly. But do you think it causes a loop? Does one kind of, you talk about fusion and AI, and do they become independent, or are they becoming dependent on each other in this loop? And
Interesting.
like
So,
any kind of turning circle or something, how do you safely exit that circle?
that's an interesting thought. It's almost like this perfect loop, right? AI makes fusion progress faster, and if the fusion succeeds, it will provide the power AI needs to scale so sustainably, if you will.
Yeah.
It's not tomorrow's trade, as you say. It's probably more an optionality for investors, especially around supporting technologies like advanced materials, grid infrastructure, and power systems. But
Yep.
yeah, it will be very interesting to watch. I'm a little bit skeptical because I sometimes see, people came out with this 10 years ago and they were saying, oh, this is going to be the future. And so far, I haven't seen anyone actually doing it, right? But probably I would have to talk to MIT and ETH here to get a real feel around how far are we away from doing that at scale.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things, and that often leads to recycling questions and the whole concept of the circular economy, and how does that play out?
Right,
We had a leader from ERI, John Serrigan, speaking, one of the world's largest leading components in that space. And you look at what they're doing with things that used to be just discarded, and they're putting it right back into the equation, and they're capturing upwards towards 90 something percent of this
wow,
recapturing of the what would otherwise be waste. So you look at that, and it winds up, the recovery process really leads to a business advantage. It becomes a competitive distinction, I think, for
right.
companies, plus keeping the environment in good seed.
It's a little bit like quantum computing, right? Where you see a lot of momentum, but it's not there yet fully, right? But you can feel it. It's just a matter of time. It's going to be a big thing, and you saw that reflected this year actually in quantum computing stocks that went through the roof, and I stayed away from it because I felt it's too early. And we're going to see probably big corrections there, but it doesn't mean this industry will not be the industry of the future. It will just probably take a little bit more time than we think from an
Yeah.
investor perspective, but maybe I'm
No,
too conservative there.
no, 100%. And we're always, I said, we mentioned the GIX platform earlier. I mean, you're always looking for that potential next investable
Right.
entity or platform, and you look at, and that's part of any, we mentioned strategy. That's part of any strategic plan, right? I mean,
Right.
you look at what's going on now, or even the market reaction the end of last week on just the whole material piece, the rare earth
Oh
conversation
yeah.
that continues, right? I mean, I mean, this is
Remining is a big thing I
sure,
heard. Remining, right?
everything we've heard.
Recycling is also something you rarely hear about, but it's a big thing. And we had some people talking about this in Climate Week.
Yeah.
Recycling, and I always feel bad when my Apple iPhone shows I'm down, or it says you need to replace it because it's not functioning that fast anymore, and we always feel compelled to then buy the next thing and throw the old one away. And the industry and the gross capitalism is just based on that, right? That system needs to be replaced every few years in order to go to the next version. And I think recycling can help here, right? And particular given these shorter cycles. And how do you feel about recycling, Glenn?
Well, I think my wife is I think I mentioned my wife is English, right? So
Right.
she grew up a big Doctor Who fan. And every couple of seasons Doctor Who regenerates into the next Doctor Who, right? So
Right.
that kind of underscores, I think, the importance of recycling. And you look at that as part of the entire infrastructure you've been describing, you can't leave it out.
Right.
Again, coming from living in New York City, and you look at what's going on with some of the stuff that you drive past on the Bell Parkway or you run past in Staten Island, and you see how it used to be done, and you see how they're now, and even my hometown of Greenpoint, Brooklyn, you see how they're doing it better now. And it
Right.
may still be there, but the plant looks different, the processes look different, and it's really part of, in a way, don't you think it's part of energy independence?
Oh, absolutely. It's all connected. I mean, also we saw, IRI doing Climate Week presenting, and so recycling is connected to data and it's connected to cybersecurity, and they're holding your data, right? I mean, this is an interconnected web, and I don't know. Did you follow that with IRI? Did you see them presenting?
I saw the conversation. Yeah, but it is national security, because you can't, right? How do you mentioned your iPhone, right? Or
Oh yeah.
you think about how many cybersecurity classes have I gone to where they say, by the way, if you plug your phone into that rent-a-car, you,
Right. Right.
you gotta untake all your stuff back, because you're putting things at risk here
I mean, cybersecurity is a great investment scheme, by the way, and it will just become more and more important. And I see that with big corporations who keep spending on it because technology has improved in good ways, but also in bad ways, where you have criminals being very active and being every second of the day they're very active, and you need to protect your assets. You need to protect, as a board, you need to make sure you have a cybersecurity framework and the right technology to make that happen. And it just requires lots of millions, I would say billions, in terms of
Yeah,
investing. And that's why I think it's interesting from a investment perspective to focus on physical defense, but also on digital defense, which is cybersecurity.
sure, sure. Well, speaking of markets, how about what are you seeing? What's the main signals you're seeing in the capital markets at the moment? You got any leading candidates here?
I'm always careful. I'm trying to stay humble and not try to give recommendations on specific stocks, because it can can backfire actually. But what I definitely see is, and I have that reflected in my portfolio this year, very much is gold mines, particularly junior mines. And they work a little bit different. So you're not looking at PEs, you look more at the cash flow situation, and it's a direct reflection of course of the gold price and the silver price. Both have gone up substantially. And that's nice if you hold these stocks, and it's nice if you hold physical or ETF gold. But at the same time, it starts worrying me because I see the S&P and Nasdaq as well are going up. So I always say either one of them must be lying, right? And one of them must be telling the truth. So I think gold is telling us the truth, in fact, and I think it comes down to the whole debt topic, and we can use another, I think, podcast discussing the debt situation, not only in the US, but in many other countries like France. And investors are very worried about that. And it's almost like a US dollar debasement strategy where now, gold has become the big thing. And of course, you have China buying lots of gold. You have other countries, central banks buying gold. And it really started to pick up substantially after Russia invaded Ukraine, and the U.S. Stopped access to the U.S. dollar for Russians. And then some countries said, okay, this could happen to me one day, right? So I better buy gold instead of treasuries. So I think that's a real secular long-term story. It's not something where I say, oh, the gold price is 4,000, and that is basically the end of it. I think probably see 4,500 this year, might see going up next year to 5,000. But again, I'm humble enough to say I might be completely wrong. And if I'm completely wrong, we will probably live in a better world, because then things are not turning out so nasty as they might be.
Well, how about sectors? You mentioned nuclear, right? We talked a little bit about
Yeah, I think
grids.
I think the circular economy we discussed today are interesting. So I looked at the FunEck Royce ETF. That's, I think, up 10% year to date. So I expect there's still room for growth, given valuations are not as stretched as in tech. So that could be a nice play as well to look at the circular economy. And I think investors are beginning to price in the value of domestic supply chains and resource security. There's also, of course, the topic of defense. And here I've been invested for I would say 15 years now in defense. And this year was the first time I sold, because I felt the hype has reached the level of retail, and everyone is buying all these defense companies, and that's reflected in very high valuations. And then I feel it's probably time to wait for the next correction to go back in.
Well, at the end of the day, right, we talk about return on investment, you talk about noise, we talk about promises, but execution often that'll be where the rubber hits the road, right? That becomes the filter, that becomes something that we can measure on. You go out, you have big speeches, you go to the UN, you put things in your annual reports,
Right.
you have advisory committees, but at the end of the day, it's the execution that's gonna come back. So on that point, Henning, how about what becomes actionable then for investors, for board members, boards of directors, people with
Well, we're
responsibility?
obviously discussing climate, right? So in terms of climate, I think it's exactly these topics that we discussed, like starting with the big one, which was real estate, right? That's when we started to talk about the technologies that are used in buildings. And that in itself is going to stay a very interesting sector, right? It has suffered a little bit through the high interest rates, and I see them coming down now, at least in the midterm. So I think real estate will be very interesting from an equity perspective, but also from a credit perspective. And then there is capital infrastructure in a broader sense. And I think here we are talking about these bigger, projects, but also technologies coming from the AI space. But the AI space itself, I'm very careful right now, because again, I think valuations are way too high. So I rather look for the underlying infrastructure and the topic that we discussed today, which is efficiency. So I can only always say look at valuations, right? That tell you the real story. And avoid anything that is going into the territory of 300 or more, which is the case in some of these stocks. So that becomes ridiculously expensive. So I think these are the big themes I see. And
Okay.
metals, you mentioned metals, those rare minerals, let's say less so, because they're not actually rare. Once you see countries and sovereigns really going into that and securing rare minerals, they're no longer rare because they're quite affluent and they're quite there. So it's more the I think gold, silver, platinum, where I look currently in the short term.
Well, again, when you look at where people are putting their bets, right? Where are they making these investments? Capital, smart money follows, capital will flow to those making the most sense, right? Maybe the less amount of noise with clearer direction. And at the end of the day, the results are good. The results are going to speak for themselves, you would think.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. And I think that's what the series is about. And I mean, it's really great just discussing climate today. I think there's so many other topics that are connected with climate, right? We talked about sovereign, we talked about defense. That could be a podcast in itself. Demographics, I think, is a big topic, and there's plenty of more to explore. So let's see where the next signal comes from, I would say.
all right. Well, listen, this is always enjoyable to talk with you. You're a wealth of insights, so well read. Great views today. Great recapping of the things we got to experience here in New York that you got to watch and participate over from Switzerland. And so thanks for having me in the conversation here at One
Well,
Business.
it's likewise. So learned a lot. Thank you, and looking forward to our next session.
All right, we will see you next time. All right, stay tuned, folks. Thanks. Bye, Henning.
Thanks.